It has always struck me as peculiar that those who most proudly call themselves realists often dismiss fairy tales as trifles for children, and yet, curiously enough, it is often in fairy tales that reality is most truthfully revealed. For the ordinary man on the street is no dragon slayer, no king, no princess in peril. And yet, when he encounters such stories, something in him stirs, as though he had remembered an old dream that was never merely a dream. A fairy tale, precisely because it does not pretend to be about real life, can slip past the watchful dragons of our skepticism. It can enter the heart before the intellect has marshaled its defenses, and once there, it plants seeds of longing, seeds that grow not into fantasy, but into truth. For fairy tales at their best do not deceive us. Rather, they awaken us to what is most deeply real. You see, the human mind is a peculiar thing. If you tell a man coldly, "You are mortal, and you must prepare to die," he may nod, he may shrug, he may even yawn. The truth, stark and naked, has a strange way of bouncing off the armor of our indifference. But if you tell him the story of a brave knight who journeys into the dark forest, where no mortal has yet returned, suddenly the truth is clothed, and it enters by a secret door. He sees in that knight's quest his own destiny. He begins to taste the solemnity of his own fragile condition. The fairy tale has carried the truth into the bloodstream of his imagination, where mere propositions could not reach. I have often thought that our Creator has made us in such a way that truth must sometimes come disguised. If you look directly at the sun, your eyes are dazzled, even blinded. But if you see its light reflected in water, or through the gold of autumn leaves, you can bear its radiance. So it is with truth. When naked, it can be unbearable. But in the form of a tale, with all the hues of wonder and beauty, we suddenly find it not only bearable, but desirable. We are drawn toward it, as if we had always longed for it, though we scarcely knew what we longed for. Fairy tales, then, are not lies. They are not escapes from reality, but rather escapes into reality. They remind us that our little world of clocks and post offices and tax returns is not the whole of existence. They whisper to us of dragons and of heroes, of betrayals and redemptions, of perils and final victories. And these whispers are not fabrications. They are echoes. For our world, too, is haunted by dragons, though they may take subtler forms, such as pride, despair, or cruelty. And our world, too, waits for heroes, not flawless men, but ordinary souls who by grace are summoned to extraordinary courage. Now, some may protest, but fairy tales are for children. Why must we indulge in childish things once we are grown? Ah, but what if the child is not merely a stage to be discarded, but rather the truest part of ourselves? Christ himself said that unless we become like little children, we shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. The child delights in wonder. The child knows that the world is full of mysteries beyond explanation. The child expects giants, angels, and miracles. Perhaps it is not the child, but the disillusioned adult who lives in an illusion. The illusion that only what can be measured is real. When I first encountered fairy tales, I was not seeking truth. I wanted adventure, marvels, and magic. Yet the odd thing was that the more I delighted in them, the more I felt within me a peculiar longing, not simply a desire for more tales, but a desire for something beyond all tales. It was as though the stories were shadows cast by a light from another country. They made me homesick for a place I had never visited, a place that seemed at once strange and utterly familiar. That longing I came to see was not a trick. It was a clue. For every fairy tale worth its salt awakens this longing. The tale of the lost prince, of the hidden kingdom, of the true king returning. These are not arbitrary inventions. They are the shapes of our deepest desire. And when Christ entered the world, he did not merely fulfill these tales. He was the tale itself, written in flesh and blood. In him, the myth became fact, the fairy tale became history, and all our longings for joy and justice found their true center. To dismiss fairy tales, then, is to dismiss the very language of our longing. It is to close our ears to the whispers that God has placed in our imagination. To cherish them is not to abandon reason, but to allow reason and imagination to be married, so that truth may enter not only the mind, but the soul. Fairy tales remind us that evil is real, but never invincible. They remind us that the world is enchanted, that behind the veil of the ordinary lies a greater drama, and that our choices matter in ways far beyond our sight. They remind us that though sorrow and danger may endure, there is always hope of a final happy ending. And in this they do not deceive us, for the gospel itself is the great story, with the truest of all happy endings. And so, I would urge you never to despise stories, least of all fairy tales. They are not mere ornaments for idle hours. They are maps. They are not escapes from life, but windows into life. They teach us that reality is not flat and dull, but shot through with meaning, with peril, with promise. And when they stir within you a strange longing for something more, do not dismiss it as childish fancy. Attend to it, for it may be the voice of your truest self, whispering of your truest home. The modern man, who prides himself on his common sense, often imagines that fairy tales are mere embroidery upon the plain cloth of life. Yet, I would say the opposite is true. The fairy tale does not embellish life. It discloses life. It lifts the veil from the ordinary and shows us what it has always been, a battlefield between good and evil, a journey through shadow toward light, a quest that demands loyalty, courage, and faith. The world of dragons and elves, of perilous journeys and final triumphs, is not less real than our own. It is more real, because it makes visible the spiritual warfare in which every soul is engaged. When you read of a kingdom under siege, threatened by a dark lord, you are not merely reading fiction. You are reading a parable of the human heart, which is daily besieged by pride, envy, lust, and despair. When you hear of a faithful knight who resists temptation, or a maiden who keeps hope alive through long years of waiting, you are being shown, in a language more vivid than sermons, the posture of the Christian life. These are not diversions from the truth, but dramatizations of it. Think for a moment of the phrase, "They all lived happily ever after." How often has that line been mocked by those who think themselves wise? Life, they say, offers no such thing. Yet, is that not precisely what our souls most desperately desire? That there should be a happiness without end. The fairy tale is laughed at, not because it lies, but because it tells too much of the truth. We want an ending that does not end. We want joy that time cannot rob, love that death cannot sever, peace that sorrow cannot shatter. The fairy tale dares to speak of such things, and the gospel dares to declare that such things are not wishful thinking, but ultimate reality. Fairy tales also perform another essential task. They teach us to be surprised by goodness. Too often, our daily lives teach us cynicism. We begin to expect betrayal, to anticipate disappointment, to steel ourselves against grief. But in fairy tales, the smallest kindness, a cup of water given to a beggar, a song sung in the dark, a word of courage whispered at the right hour, can turn the tide of the whole story. Goodness, in these tales, is not boring. It is radiant. It shines brighter against the darkness. And when it comes, it does so with a kind of holy shock. Is that not exactly how grace works in our own lives? It breaks in unexpectedly, overturning despair with joy, shame with forgiveness, death with life. Let me add this. Fairy tales also teach us humility, for they remind us that the world is larger than we know. In these tales, there are always hidden realms, doors that open into strange lands, animals that speak, powers that lie just beyond the horizon. And is this not precisely how the world truly is? We who live in the age of microscopes and telescopes have begun to imagine that all reality is mapped. Yet even science itself whispers otherwise, that the universe is vaster, stranger, and more mysterious than we could ever comprehend. Fairy tales train the soul to expect surprise, to be humble before mystery, to acknowledge that we are not masters of the cosmos, but pilgrims in an enchanted land. Above all, fairy tales awaken longing. The Germans call it Sehnsucht, that deep yearning for we know not what, a tale of a lost kingdom, of a hidden treasure, of a beloved who must be sought and found. These stir in us a restlessness that no earthly pleasure can quiet. I have felt it myself since boyhood, the ache that no amount of food or laughter or achievement could satisfy. Fairy tales did not create that ache. They revealed it. They reminded me that I was made for another country, that the homesickness I felt was not absurd, but prophetic. For if we find in ourselves a hunger that no earthly feast can fill, then surely we were made for a feast beyond the earth. In the end, the reason fairy tales matter is that they are small echoes of the great story. The gospel is, after all, the truest fairy tale, the story in which the king descends from his throne, disguises himself in humility, slays the dragon not with sword but with sacrifice, and rescues his beloved bride at the cost of his own life. And unlike our fairy tales, this story is not make-believe. It is the foundation of all that is, the axis of history, the hope of the world. To delight in fairy tales, then, is to practice recognizing truth in its many disguises. It is to sharpen the eye of imagination so that, when the great story comes upon us, we are not blind to its beauty. And perhaps, if we have learned to believe in dragons, we will also be prepared to believe in angels. If we have learned to hope for happily ever after, we may be ready to receive eternal joy. So I urge you, do not cast aside stories as idle amusements. Let them be what they truly are: lanterns along the dark road, windows opening into eternity, whispers of a greater voice calling us home. For the world itself is God's story, and each of us, whether we know it or not, is living a chapter. There is, I think, a grave danger in our modern neglect of stories. For when we cease to nourish the imagination, we do not thereby escape its influence. We merely hand it over to lesser things. The imagination is like a garden. If you do not plant noble seeds, weeds will spring up of their own accord. And the weeds, in this case, are not harmless. They take the form of cheap entertainments, cynical satires, or dark fantasies that revel in despair. These, too, are stories, but they twist the soul instead of enlarging it. They offer not wonder, but weariness, not hope, but nihilism. A people starved of true tales will not cease to dream. They will dream badly. This is why I contend that fairy tales are not optional. They are nourishment for the soul. To read of heroes who resist temptation is to strengthen the moral muscles of the child who reads it, and, I might add, of the adult who has not yet ceased to be teachable. To watch a prince renounce his throne for love is to glimpse, however faintly, the logic of the incarnation. To see evil defeated not by cruelty, but by sacrifice, is to learn that the cross is the deepest wisdom of the world. I must also remind you that fairy tales, at their best, do not offer us a sugary world where everything is easy. No, most often they begin in darkness. They are full of dungeons, betrayals, curses, and exile. Yet they do not end there, and herein lies their truth. They mirror the structure of the Christian story, which begins in a world under the shadow of sin, and yet moves inexorably toward redemption. Fairy tales teach us to hope precisely because they teach us to endure darkness without losing sight of dawn. They show us that pain, though bitter, is not final, that suffering, though sharp, is not ultimate. Consider how a child learns courage. You cannot give him a lecture on the abstract concept of bravery and expect him to become brave. But if you tell him of a hobbit who leaves his comfortable hole to face dragons, or of a girl who ventures into a cursed land to save her brother, you plant in him the seed of courage. The story gives flesh to the virtue. It shows him what bravery looks like, feels like, costs. And when the hour comes in his own life, when he must face the bully, or confess the truth, or stand against the tide, he has within him the memory of heroes. He has already rehearsed in imagination the part he must play. It is no accident that Scripture itself so often speaks in stories. When Nathan the prophet came to rebuke David, he did not present him with a syllogism. He told him a story of a poor man with a single lamb and a rich man who stole it. The story pierced where logic could not. Christ himself taught in parables, not because the truth was too weak to stand alone, but because the truth clothed in story becomes irresistible. It arrests the mind, unsettles the heart, and awakens the soul. If, then, even the Word of God comes to us so often in the form of story, dare we despise stories? They are, in a sense, sacraments of meaning, outward forms that convey inward grace. They give us not only instruction, but transformation. They train our affections, so that we may love what is truly lovable, and hate what is truly hateful. And do not think that this is only for the young. Indeed, as we grow older, our need for stories may increase, not diminish. For cynicism creeps upon us with the passing years, and we need fairy tales to remind us that life is not a grim machine, grinding toward nothingness. We need them to remind us that there are still miracles, that love is still stronger than death, that the King is still on the throne. So, I say again, fairy tales awaken truth. They awaken courage, humility, wonder, hope, and above all, longing. And it is longing that most mysterious of hungers, which points us beyond this world. For no fairy tale satisfies us completely. Even the happiest ending leaves us yearning for more. That yearning is not a failure of the tale. It is its greatest gift. It teaches us that no story, save one, can truly fulfill our desire. And that one is the great story, written not with ink, but with the blood of Christ, and sealed not with once upon a time, but with, "Behold, I make all things new." Therefore, let us not despise the fairy tale. Let us read it, cherish it, tell it to our children, and keep its flame alive in our own hearts. For in doing so, we are not retreating from reality, but advancing toward it. We are training our vision to see that the world is more enchanted than we dreamed, and that behind the veil of ordinary days there lies a kingdom where joy is endless, love is unshadowed, and every story finds its true and final ending. If stories matter so greatly, then we must also reckon with the fact that the enemy of our souls seeks to corrupt them, for he knows their power. He knows that imagination, once captured, can move men to acts of nobility or to acts of unspeakable cruelty. It has been well said that the devil is a liar, but it is equally true that he is a plagiarist. He takes the form of story, which God meant to be a lantern of truth, and twists it into a vessel of despair. This is why false myths are so dangerous. They offer grandeur without goodness, power without sacrifice, endless cycles without hope of consummation. They intoxicate, but they do not nourish. Here, then, lies our responsibility, to discern between stories that illuminate and stories that obscure. The test is simple, though not always easy to apply. A true story, whether in fairy tale or novel or poem, will awaken in us longing that leads upward, toward goodness, beauty, and truth. A false story will leave us restless, but without hope, fascinated, but empty, hungry, but with no bread to eat. The one whispers of heaven, the other drags us toward the abyss. And yet, the existence of false stories should not cause us to distrust all stories, any more than the existence of counterfeit coins should lead us to despise gold. Rather, their very counterfeiting is a testimony to the value of the thing imitated. Nobody forges pennies. So, too, nobody would bother corrupting stories if they were not of immense consequence. Now, it is often asked, why must stories contain so much suffering, so many tears, so much peril? Could not the fairy tale give us only sweetness? But such tales would not satisfy us, for they would not mirror life. A paradise without dragons would be no paradise at all, for there would be no courage, no trust, no triumph. The Christian knows that the cross precedes the crown, and fairy tales in their own way whisper the same truth. The road to joy is through trial. The hero must walk through the valley of shadow before he reaches the light of the morning. But mark this well. Though suffering fills the tale, it is never the final word. The happy ending is not tacked on as a cheerful afterthought, nor is it an escape from the grimness. It is the very logic of the story, the rightful resolution of all its threads. Evil may rage, but it is not sovereign. Death may strike, but it is not ultimate. The happily ever after is not childish delusion, it is prophecy. For in the great story, written by the author of all things, there is indeed a final joy that no shadow can extinguish. How differently we would live if we believed this with all our hearts. We should not despair when darkness falls, for we would remember that every good tale begins in peril. We should not think our sufferings meaningless, for we would recall that in every true story, trials are the making of the hero. And we should not doubt that joy awaits us, for we would know that the author himself has promised it. I think often of that marvelous line in the Revelation of St. John, "He will wipe away every tear from their eyes." Here is the ultimate fairy tale ending. And yet it is truer than stone, truer than death itself. For the hand that wipes away those tears is the hand that shaped the worlds. When the author enters his own story, then all tales of sorrow will be seen as preludes, all laments as overtures, all shadows as the dark canvas upon which glory is painted. So I say again, cherish stories. They are the training ground of hope. They are the windows of eternity. They are the echo of a music we have not yet heard in full. And when your heart aches with longing at the close of a fairy tale, when you feel the pang of, "I wish it could be so," do not dismiss it. That longing is the fingerprint of God upon your soul, pointing you home. For you and I, we are not merely readers of stories. We are characters within one. A great drama is unfolding around us. Every choice, every act of courage or cowardice, of faith or despair, is a thread in that tapestry. And the end has already been written. Not despair, but glory. Not night, but morning. Not loss, but everlasting joy. One of the deepest gifts of story is that it enlarges the soul by teaching us to see through other eyes. When you step into the shoes of the peasant girl, the weary pilgrim, the lonely king, or even the talking beast, you are momentarily released from the prison of self. This is no small mercy, for most of our sins are fed by the tyranny of self, self-pity, self-exaltation, self-protection. Story breaks that tyranny. It allows us to suffer with another, to rejoice with another, to feel compassion where before we felt indifference. And in this way, story does what no argument can. It tutors the heart in charity. Fairy tales accomplish this most powerfully because they strip away the familiar disguises of our selfishness. If you tell a man about injustice in his own city, he may argue about economics or politics, but tell him of a poor shoemaker who shares his bread with a stranger and finds himself repaid with blessing, and he feels in his very bones the rightness of generosity. The imagination, once captured, becomes an ally of conscience, and conscience fortified by imagination becomes action. But more than compassion, stories awaken vision. We live, most of us, in a narrow hallway of fluorescent lights and petty errands. Our sight grows dull. Our desires shrink to the scale of mere survival. Fairy tales fling open the windows. They remind us that life is not a drab corridor, but a vast landscape of peril and possibility. They remind us that we are, each of us, heirs of a kingdom, though presently in rags. Soldiers in a battle, though often we forget the enemy. Pilgrims on a road, though we sometimes mistake the roadside inn for our home. In this sense, stories do not distract us from reality. They recall us to reality. They awaken us from the sleepwalking of habit. Some will still protest. But is it not dangerous to fill minds with fantasies? Should we not keep our feet on the ground? I reply, yes, keep your feet on the ground, but let your heart have wings. For without wings, the feet soon forget where they are going. The man who reads only newspapers may think himself practical, but he risks becoming the most deluded of all. For he has traded the eternal for the ephemeral, the great story for the daily gossip. Better to read of dragons and remember that evil is real, than to read only of stocks and forget that the soul is eternal. You see, story is not the enemy of reason, but its companion. Reason is the compass. Imagination is the map. Reason can tell us where north lies, but only imagination can show us the mountains and rivers, the perils and glories of the land we must cross. To travel without reason is madness. To travel without imagination is blindness. Together, they lead us home, and if, in the end, all stories are but echoes, then our task is to follow the echo back to its source. The stories that stir us most deeply are those that most resemble the gospel, however faintly. The true king returning in disguise, the battle against overwhelming darkness, the final victory of light, all these are signposts pointing to Christ. He is the fulfillment of every tale we ever loved. The fairy tale is but the shadow. Christ is the substance. So then, let us not despise the shadow, for it teaches us to recognize the light. Let us not mock the fairy tale, for it prepares us for the gospel. And let us not dismiss longing as foolishness, for it is the very whisper of eternity within us. If I may leave you with one final thought, it is this: the world is itself a story, and we are all characters within it. This is not a metaphor, nor a mere flourish of the poet's pen. It is a truth that presses upon us with greater weight than stone. For if life were only a succession of accidents, if we were but atoms drifting aimlessly in the void, then nothing would matter. Not love, not sacrifice, not suffering, not joy. But if life is a story, written by an author whose wisdom is beyond our comprehension, then every word, every tear, every choice carries infinite meaning. The fairy tale, in its humble way, prepares us to believe this. It trains us to expect coherence, to look for purpose, to trust that the chaos of chapter 3 may yet be resolved in chapter 12. It assures us that though evil may seem to triumph, though the villain may hold the stage for a time, yet the story bends toward justice. This is why, deep down, we never tire of hearing, and they lived happily ever after. Our souls know, even if our minds forget, that this is what we were made for. A happiness without shadow, a joy without end. And yet, the great paradox is this: the only way to such joy is through the sorrowful road, just as the knight must endure the dark wood before he reaches the castle, just as the maiden must face the witch before she sees the dawn, so too must we pass through suffering before glory. The cross before the crown, the furnace before the feast. Fairy tales do not flinch from this truth, and neither should we. But they also remind us that the darkness is never the conclusion. The author writes with both ink and fire, and his final word is always light. We are so easily tempted to dismiss longing as mere illusion. We say to ourselves, it is only a feeling, a dream, a child's fancy. But what if the longing is the truest thing about us? What if the very ache for a world made whole is itself evidence that such a world exists? A fish does not dream of flying, for wings are not in its nature, but man dreams of eternity, and eternity, I dare say, is in his nature indeed. Fairy tales awaken that dream not to mock us, but to point us toward its fulfillment. And so, I urge you, Do not grow weary of stories. Read them, tell them, cherish them. Let them awaken in you both longing and hope. For when the King returns in glory, and he will, you shall find that the greatest fairy tale has become fact, and that all the stories you loved were but faint rehearsals for the joy of that eternal day. Until then, walk bravely, live faithfully, and keep the lantern of imagination burning. For it is by that light that we shall recognize, when the final chapter is written, that the author of all good tales has woven us into his eternal masterpiece. Thank you for listening, my friends. If these reflections have stirred something in your heart, I invite you to like this video, share it with others who may find hope in its words, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you wish to journey further with us into these great mysteries, do not forget to subscribe to our channel. Together, let us keep alive the wonder that leads us home.